Hello again, and welcome to this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thank you for joining us for the podcast where real stories are so much more interesting than fiction. Today on Stories from Real Life, I'm joined by Scot Loyd, a writer, historian, scholar of religion and race, and author of The God I Was Given. We're discussing this topic because of Nolan Wells' July 4th death. He's a young black man who tragically died after a boating outing with a group of his white friends. I realize this is a sensitive and ongoing issue, but we're going to discuss it because not all stories from real life are fun stories. I became aware of Scot because of his viral Facebook post about his magazine essay regarding his late friend Roy. Scot, thanks for being here today, and we're going to talk about a lot about your story and about Roy. So thanks for being here.
Here, Mel. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm honored to have you. So tell us about Roy and why you chose to write to him instead of about him.
Yeah. The the original post that I penned was back in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement protest that sprung up all over the country in the summer of 2020. I think all of us can remember the rush of emotions that we were feeling. And for several years, decades before that, I had re-entered education, pursuing my PhD in heritage studies, which is basically the study of history, how we receive history, how we talk about history, and how we present that to the public in institutions. My background is in higher ed. I'm a communications professor, earned a master's degree in communications. I coached collegiate speech and debate. But I also had a very real interest because of my background growing up in a small Pentecostal church, in studying the religious history of that particular movement in the United States and globally. And just in the rush of emotions that I think all of us were feeling as a nation in the summer of 2020, I began to reflect on the relationship that I had with my childhood friend, whose name was Roy Butler. He was a young black man who was picked up on our Sunday school bus in our predominantly white Pentecostal church. And he and I were roughly the same age, and we became close friends. And when we first met, we were both just entering junior high school. And Roy continued to attend our church throughout high school. And as I began to reflect on that relationship and what I had learned, not only about myself, but about our nation's history, about the small town that I grew up in, Arkansas, in Northeast Arkansas, there were a lot of things that I wish I could have expressed to my friend Roy when we were younger. After high school, he and I drifted apart. I got married. I pursued ministry, and he joined the Army. And I later learned, tragically, that my friend Roy passed away from the complications of a brain tumor in his late 20s. And since then, I've been able to reconnect with his brother, his older brother, who also attended our church briefly, and his younger sister, and have had some good conversations with them. But just in a flood of emotions, I wrote this letter because these are things that I wish I would have had the vocabulary or the capacity or the knowledge to talk with him about during that time. And basically, the letter just expresses the idea that even though my intentions were good, I think, I was wanting to have friends outside of my ethnicity, outside of my race. Looking back, everything that we were doing as a predominantly white church, even with the Pentecostal heritage, it was steeped in what a lot of us white folks are blind to, and that's the idea that there are systems in place in this nation that favor people who look like me. And I think if you study history, if you look at any statistical measurement that you want to in the United States, it's readily available for those who are willing to see it, that there are some real disparities between the experiences of Black people in this nation and white people in this nation. And unfortunately, we're unwilling to talk about that as much as we need to, I think, so that we can move forward. So it was an attempt. It was clumsy. It was cringy at times. And I received some much needed correction for portions of the letter. And I'm open to receiving that. I know that I have much to learn. I know that as a white male in the United States, that I still benefit from this system. And, lots of folks get caught up on the phrase white privilege. And I understand why, because sometimes when white folks hear that, they think, well, people are making assumptions that I didn't grow up poor. I did grow up poor, that I didn't have to work hard. I did have to work hard. But what white privilege simply means is that I've never had to fear for my life in a routine traffic stop. I've never been treated as a suspect. Nobody has ever thought that my desire for help was somehow rooted in nefarious ends. People are always willing to help me. And so even though I grew up in the poorest county statistically in the United States, in the Mississippi River Delta, I, upon reflection, now see that my Black peers were treated really different than I was growing up in the same context. And that was true, no doubt, for my friend Roy. And I just wished I would have had the opportunity to have these conversations with him as an adult, because as a kid, even though, for the time and for what we knew, our relationship was something out of the ordinary. Our friendship was something out of the ordinary. There were lots of problems about it still in retrospect that I now see that I couldn't see then, that I wish I would have had the opportunity to talk with him about. And that's basically what the letter was all about.
Okay. So you have some photographs with you and Roy. So how did those old photographs with him remind you of the recent tragedy with Nolan Wells?
Yeah. So when the Nolan Wells tragedy came out, there's lots of photographs that are being circulated where Nolan is the only Black young man among a group of white young men. And so looking back to those photographs that I have of me and my friend Roy in the 1980s, it was the same sort of pictures, right? It was a group of white friends with a lone uh, Black young man. And in fact, when I penned my letter back in 2020, I called it a letter to Roy. He's the Black guy in all of my pictures. And he was there. He was right by my side. We were inseparable. But what I know now and what I understand now is that I have the opportunity as a white man in this country to think about these issues and to talk about these issues, and then to forget about them and to go back to my quote unquote normal life. But for people of color, for Black men, for Black women in this nation, if they are in predominantly white um, uh, uh, organizations or institutions, they have to be vigilant. They have to be on guard, because I believe that they understand, as the Nolan Wells story is bearing out, that perhaps one wrong word or wrong look or something that is said or misinterpreted can be misconstrued. And I don't know what happened in with Nolan Wells. I think the investigation will bear that out, hopefully. But what I was writing about was the larger context of, this is why you're seeing a different response from the African American community about this story than what you're seeing in a lot of areas in white communities as they look at the same story.
Okay. I want to share something personal here after I read your Facebook post the other day. I thought deeply about that situation with Roy being the black kid in the picture, because I was that kid in my youth, my circles. I was the black kid in our church, for instance, almost the only black kid at my college. I went to college in Arkansas, the other side of the state from where you were. You said you were Northeast. I was in Northwest at John Brown University. You probably heard of it.
Yeah.
And I had a situation my freshman year in college with a group, small group of white friends who decided it would be funny to go to the woods and and then leave me there. And thankfully, there was no alcohol involved. I was totally sober, so I was easy. It was easy enough for me to find the main road myself. But if this had been a situation where some alcohol was involved, there was a big lake nearby. It was dark. Who knows what could have happened? That wouldn't have been their intention, but that would have been the same outcome. And so the your essay and then thinking on my own life made it really uncomfortable, even after 40 years. Things that I hadn't thought about in years and years. So I wanted to have a conversation with you about that and just be open from both sides to talk about how people are expressing themselves and how they are gathering information and how memories create physical responses when you're used to being on the defensive, we'll say. So, and one of the themes I hear in your writing is that memory is selective. Remember friendships warmly while forgetting the social systems surrounding them. So, tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah. So a lot of times we can look back on the same set of circumstances and remember them completely different based upon our perspective. And so, for a large part of my life, I would look back on my friendship with my friend Roy, and even though I understood the problematic nature of the history in the South, I looked at our friendship as something that was progressive, something that at the time I was operating out of a heart that was informed by my religious beliefs, by my Christianity, by my desire to reach out beyond what I knew and what I understood. And quite honestly, I did not see a lot of close friendships between white people and black people. I did have thankfully, a diverse school. We grew up next to an Air Force base, and so we had diversity not only from the community, which was about 60% African American, but we also had experiences with children who had been raised around the world and brought that into my small rural school. And so looking back on it, after having completed some of my studies where I began to listen very carefully to the experiences of Black Americans and to read some of the problematic nature of what happened even in Mississippi County, Arkansas, well into the 1980s with lynchings and racial violence and things of that nature. I can only imagine that, looking back on that, how I imagine Roy must have felt in some of those situations. And, if the roles were reversed, I don't know that I would have had the same courage or the same charisma, personal charisma to be able to navigate those particular situations. I think we were all aware of the racial climate because as I write in my book, we all experienced times when the N word was thrown about in his presence, and people said things that were derogatory, and sometimes Roy would laugh it off. Other times, we would all be quiet until somebody broke the silence, and I was always apologetic, but very rarely did I confront, if ever, the direct racism that was directed at him. First of all, because a lot of it was just sort of, it was sort of part of the culture. It was sort of, this is what happens. This is how people talk. This is how it goes on. And then also we were children. We were teenagers. We were living in this adult world. And it doesn't excuse it, but it does explain it. So there's no justification, but there's certainly an explanation as to why I didn't speak up more when I should have. And so I just, considering how his memories of that might have been after talking to grown Black people who have had similar experiences to Roy's, I can imagine that he felt the same way. And, it's very easy for people who look like me to look back on, what they consider to be well-intentioned efforts to reach out to other communities. But a lot of it is just steeped in white paternalism. The idea, that, well, as white folks, we know better than the Black community. We can help them, and it really is just racism dressed up in different clothes, in church clothes, if you will, that still makes people feel less than and marginalized. And so I can imagine that Roy felt a lot of those feelings. And if he was with us today, I would have wanted him to have the opportunity to speak without judgment. And I think that's where white folks, they make a lot of situations worse, is that they perhaps might listen to a Black friend or a coworker or acquaintance describe a situation or circumstance, but then they're quick to dismiss it, and they'll say something like, "Well, they didn't mean that. That's not really what happened. What they meant was this." Well, give people the opportunity and the dignity to share their experience without judgment and without correction. As white folks, sometimes the best thing we can do is just shut up and listen.
Yeah. So I want to add something to what I said earlier. It's all of what I said was true. Um, my friends were all white, and I don't, if they're listening to this, I don't want them to take that as something that's derogatory. I greatly valued those friendships. I really needed those friendships. It was at a time when we met in high school. My dad died when I was 13 years old, so I was in the eighth grade, and I was drifting. I didn't know what to do. My mom was trying her best at that point. I was the only one still at home, and my grades were falling off. I was just drifting because my dad and I were very close. And so those relationships that I made with those people at church really helped stabilize me, because I saw the things that they had as goals, that I that my dad once had goals as goals for me, and that helped me reconnect with his memory, and so that helped me get back on the path that I needed to be on to get to where I needed to go. So I certainly don't want those friends to think I'm denigrating them at all. I'm not. And some of them I'm still very close friends with. And one guy in particular, we've been friends for 45 years. And after the right after the George Floyd situation, he called me and he said, "I just wanted to check on you to make sure you're okay. Right? I know there are a lot of people who are hurting, and I just want to make sure you're okay." That meant the world to me. That our friendship was strong before that, but for me, that it took on a whole other level. So I definitely want to make sure I'm clear about that. And then to go back to Roy and some of the scenarios you brought up, the same group of friends who took me out in the woods and left me, I'd heard probably the same school year, but sometime later, that one of the guys in the group said to the other ones, or said to someone else, "I like Melvin. He's not," and then he said the N word. So in his mind, I was an exception. I was acceptable. I met the standards that he considered um, mainstream, I suppose. And you talked about that with the situation with the Black kids in the car next to you.
Right.
Could you relay that story real quickly?
Yeah, so I relate this in the article, and it's also in the book. A lot of times on Sunday nights after church, we'd all pile in somebody's car and we'd go out to get pizza or whatever. And me and Roy were in the back, and there were some friends of mine that were in the front seat. And my friend pulled up to gas up his car, and at the same time, another car pulled in, a group of black young men, and um, I don't know the context. I'm assuming that it was something that maybe happened at school, but they began to hurl insults at the white guys that were driving the car, and and there was just verbal insults going back and forth like young teenagers will often do. And then when our friend got back in the car, shut the door, there was another young man in the front seat, and he just blurted out as we pulled away, "I hate the N words." And Roy is sitting right there in the back seat with me, and I didn't say anything. I was embarrassed, and Roy didn't say anything. And then after a mile or two down the road, the driver of the car made the same statement that your friend made. Roy, you're not an N word. And what I write about in the book is that um, it's weird to think about, because we as white kids in the car were making a differentiation between Roy in the car with us and the group of black kids that were in the other car, and that somehow that they were less than what he was based upon our proclamation. But Roy must have understood that if the situation got out of hand, or if there was something that was said or something that was misinterpreted, the same white kids that were deeming him acceptable could very easily turn on him and deem him unacceptable and label him with that derogatory and racial slur. So I think that if you were that lone black kid in that predominantly white group, especially growing up in the time when you and I grew up, and it seems like it's increasing, even making a comeback today, that that if you're that lone black kid, you're going to be subjected to that kind of language. And it really is sad that we're still dealing with this in the day and age in which we live.
It absolutely is sad, and it's I would say I've resisted the temptation to say that it's increasing or getting worse. I think it's more public, but still, it's clearly more public with social media. But I think it is getting worse. I think it's becoming acceptable to a certain demographic, a certain sub demographic, we'll say, within the dominant culture. So if Roy were there with you, and the two of you were watching the George Floyd video, what do you think that conversation would have been like?
Well, I think Roy would have understood, hopefully, that, as all of us understand, that what we saw in Minneapolis was another example of police brutality. Whatever problems George Floyd might have had did not justify him being killed on the street by a police officer. I think, knowing what I know of Roy, he would have understood that intuitively. My friend Roy he was always kind. He was always empathetic. He was always understanding. He had a heart for the underdog. And I think that's one of the reasons why he chose to be, friends with me. Of our group, I was the least athletic. I was going to be the last one picked, for the pickup basketball or football or whatever we did. We would play football on Sunday afternoons, and I was basically the tackling dummy, right? So he looked out for me in a lot of ways. He was a protector. So I think he would have been shocked, as all of us were there in the summer of 2020. And the fact remains that you can point to whatever statistical measurement you want to, but the idea of what happens around policing and how black communities feel about police versus white communities is very telling. And I share this all the time. Even though I get nervous still when a police officer pulls me over, I'm never fearful that I'm going to die. But yet, that's something that Black people report feeling on a daily basis in this country, especially if you are a Black young man and you are pulled over by law enforcement.
Hmm. I've got so many stories that will just come flooding to the front of my brain. There's one story I want to tell real quick that's fairly recent. My family and I went to Europe in last month, and we did a tour of several countries. Very quick tour. We weren't in any place more than 2 days, and we were in Heidelberg, Germany, which I really liked while I was there. And I went into the souvenir shop and I wanted to buy a T-shirt or a hat, and it was just me and the guy running the cash register. We were the only two in there. And then he said, I need to go do something. I don't know wherever it was. It wasn't far away, but he said, just stay here and look around. I need to go do this errand. And I was shocked. Like I have grown accustomed to being watched my whole life when I go into a store. I'm consciously aware of it. I've never stolen anything in my life, but I'm very aware of being a suspect. And so being in that situation was so weird because I thought, well, now I've got to stay until he comes back, even if I don't buy anything, because I don't want to leave and then have him think I stole something.
Yeah.
And so I'm standing there just looking around like that meme with that kid who's like with his eyes shut.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like, what do I do? I don't want to give him any reason to think I stole something. I don't plan to steal anything, but I can't leave so he can see I didn't steal anything. It was, but the fact that he trusted me was also telling to me, and it had an impact on me.
And a very
So
different experience than what you've had growing up here in the United States and living in the United States. And
yeah,
that is telling.
and that's something that if you never experienced that kind of suspicion, you would have no idea why I would respond the way I did. None. It would seem innocent. It would seem inconsequential, but it had a huge impact on me in multiple ways. All right, so let's get back to talking about this story with George Floyd and Roy and Nolan Wells and all how things all come together. We were talking about how Roy and you might respond if you were watching the video together. One thing that was that I think most people didn't understand about the George Floyd video and the aftermath. For me personally, we'll keep it personal. I've never felt so vulnerable in my life. I didn't know George Floyd. I didn't I didn't want to know George Floyd. I didn't have the same kind of lifestyle he had, but there was an identification there that made me think that could have been me, or it could still be me, and it made me feel very vulnerable. There are two times in my life I felt the most vulnerable. That one, I felt the most vulnerable as a Black person, and then after the election of 2024, when 86% of white evangelicals voted for Trump again, I felt unsafe at church. And I've essentially stopped going to church since then. My faith hasn't changed. I just choose to be much more private about it, we'll say. And so that's a situation where somebody would respond and say, why are you bringing politics into it? Well, I'm not the one who brought the politics into it. I'm just the one
Right.
responding to the politics that somebody else brought into it.
Exactly. Yeah, and
And
that's the reality that most white folks aren't willing to listen to. That your experience is not an anomaly. Your experience, that's a very personal experience. But if you listen to the overwhelming majority of Black people in this nation, they will tell you similar stories. And you know what a lot of those white folks will do that look like me? They will scour the internet for two or three Black folks that parrot what they believe to be true and ignore the thousands upon thousands of Black people who are telling the same story. And it boggles the mind. It really does.
Well, that's what I call using people as a mascot or a badge. And I actually have that question for a little bit later, so I'll wait until then to discuss it further. But is one of the greatest barriers to racial understanding the belief that good intentions automatically equals understanding? So how so?
Yeah. So we all believed growing up in that predominantly white Pentecostal church that we were fulfilling the Great Commission, that we were doing the Lord's work, reaching out to this Black community. And again, remember that I grew up in a city that was roughly 60% African American, 40% Caucasian, but yet white people controlled all the power structures in the city. We were a predominantly white Pentecostal church. And keep in mind that global Pentecostalism was founded in 1906 in Los Angeles by a Black man, William J. Seymour, who led a revival there, an integrated revival, and all of his innovations that he brought to bear upon American Christianity, his influence was practically erased as white pastors took his innovations, took them back to the South, to their segregated churches, to the exclusion of Black people. And we were growing up in that context, and yet we were still thinking, well, we're in a better position to educate and to help these quote unquote poor Black children. So even though our intentions, ill-informed as they were, might have been coming from a good place, I really do believe that the people in my church wanted to help others. But the way that we were going about it was just steeped in racism. And that is what happens in these predominantly white institutions, is they become so incubated to the experiences of others that they judge every experience through their own lens. And if you take that out to the wider culture, think about how Black celebrities have been treated and mistreated in our culture. Based upon their proximity to whiteness or white normative culture, they are rewarded. But the moment that they would deviate or do something that white culture deems unacceptable, like Colin Kaepernick, right, who takes a knee, protesting police brutality, the white community that loves football loses their mind. And again, he loses his job basically, not necessarily because he's a bad quarterback, but because he deviated from what white culture thinks is acceptable. Think about how many times LeBron James has spoken out about racial issues, or other celebrities or athletes that might happen to be Black. And the moment that they do, if white culture deems that they go too far, then they are canceled, or somebody will say something derogatory like, shut up and dribble, entertain us. And it becomes, a show based upon what the white normative culture deems acceptable. And Black people in this system are rewarded for their proximity to whiteness, but then they are punished, and sometimes severely punished, even to the point of being canceled if they dare to speak up or speak out on any of these issues.
Do you think America has become better at listening at all since 2020?
No, I think I think we've taken a step backwards, and I think I think what we see in America, we see a lot of these pendulum swings, and I think in 2020 we saw people paying attention, and we saw institutions making real changes, significant changes. I think of NASCAR removing the Confederate flag, banning the Confederate flag, things, that, just a few years earlier, a few generations earlier, would have been deemed impossible. But now I think we're in the current climate. There's a black religious scholar by the name of Jamar Tisby, and he says, he says it very frankly. He said, "You don't think they were going to let 2020 go unpunished, did you?" The fact of the matter is that we saw all of those protests in 2020. We saw all of these institutions and corporations responding, rightly so, to the murder of George Floyd. But now you're seeing that pendulum swing again. And I think it's with everything that this current administration is doing to dismantle the progress that was made. We're living in a very precarious time for race relations in the United States.
So how do we keep conversations about race from becoming ideological debates rather than making them human conversations?
Yeah, that's the difficulty, isn't it? Because the internet and media and so much of our society has become binary. We've only got two choices, right? And so you're either in this camp or in that camp. You're either for this or you're against it. As you know, I think as everyone who's had any sort of life experience understands, is that a lot of life is nuanced. That a lot of life is not either or, it's both and. And what these ideological debates do is they end up dividing us. Whereas when we have conversations like we're having now, and the tone that I endeavored to strike in my letter and in my article about Nolan Wells was that there's an understanding that Black Americans have about living in the United States. There's an understanding that white Americans have about living in the United States. And until we are willing as white Americans to really listen, not listen to judge, not listen to correct, not listen to excuse, but really listen, we're not going to understand, because we're like everyone else. We are blinded by what we deem to be our normal life experience. And so I think the way that we overcome that is by having conversations like we're having today. So thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. So you spent years studying history. Do you believe empathy can actually change history?
I think we are dealing in a time where there is a severe lack of empathy. You even see empathy being attacked. You, you even see empathy being attacked, right, in some aspects of Christianity. There's been books that have been written that said empathy is a sin, which which again I can't wrap my mind around that, because I'm like, have you guys read Jesus? Have you studied Jesus? Have you looked at how Jesus interacted with others? And so when we apply the lens of empathy to history, what we do, and what I've tried to do in my heritage studies, is to understand that this nation, with all of its flaws, it was founded for the benefit of white males specifically, white people generally, but white males specifically. And for a long time, white women didn't even enjoy the vote. And certainly not people of color, certainly not Black people in this nation. So when we look at history, when we apply the lens of empathy to it, what we do is we start looking for the voices that history ignored. Who were the people that didn't have an opportunity to speak, or they were enslaved, or they were conquered, or they were decimated by war and by relocation? And are we giving them an opportunity to speak? So what I do in my historical work, and what many historians are doing today, is they're saying, yes, these are the big facts of history. This is what happened, but let's go back and let's listen to the voices that history ignored. I think if we apply that empathetic lens, that will help all of us be better citizens and a better nation, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah. So have any Black people talked to you personally and shared some type of a relief that you finally understood the situation as it came to Roy, your friendship with Roy?
Yeah, that's a great question. For overwhelmingly back in 2020, the response from Black people, especially I'm 54 years old, especially from Black people that were around my age and had many experiences like Roy would have experienced back in the 80s and the 90s through a bus ministry with a predominantly white church. They reached out to me and they said, I was Roy. I know exactly what you're talking about. I experienced this is an encouragement to me. Um, what I what I what I did not expect, and what is welcomed now, I see it as a gift, was that there are a lot of younger people, a lot of younger Black people who didn't appreciate my efforts, and they pointed out, and rightly so, that even though emotionally I was writing from a good place, trying to make sense and trying to have a conversation with a friend that I wish I had had the opportunity to have earlier, I still centered my voice. I still made it about me in a lot of ways. And I understand that. I even if you look very closely at the comments on my most recent post about Nolan Wells, you have some Black folks that reach out and say, it still sounds like you're trying to capitalize on this, or you're trying to sell your book, or you're trying to do this, that, and the other. And again, I understand that because I know from listening that my experience is not going to be what Black folks are experiencing in this country today, especially younger people. They have listened for generations to white folks like me make promises that things are going to change and things are going to get better, and they're not. And so for a lot of them, if you look to the political left in this nation, a lot of them are saying, this system isn't worth preserving. Now, as a white male, as that scares me a little, but it scares me for the right reasons, because I understand that it was built for me. I benefit from this system. And so there's a little part of me that's always like, well, we got to preserve the status quo. We got to move. We can't have a revolution. But there are lots of folks that the reality that they're experiencing in this nation, people are already shooting at them. They're already wondering where their next meal is coming from. They're already wondering where their next paycheck is going to come from. They're wondering, how am I going to take care of my kids? How am I going to take care of my family? How am I going to provide adequate housing, education, whatever? And then you've got white police officers that are out here harassing. You've got ICE in the streets that are rounding people up in unmarked cars, and in some cases killing people. So I can absolutely understand the pushback from some younger people who says, this is just more white man's tears, and nothing's changing.
Wow. All right, so I've only got one question left. I normally end on sort of a fluffy question, but I'm going to challenge you and end on something much, much more difficult. So, how do others get to the point where people are no longer treated as mascots and badges, as I mentioned earlier, and are finally treated as whole persons? And I'm talking specifically about interpersonal relationships and in predominantly white churches.
Yeah, well, something you said earlier stuck with me, and you're exactly right that, there's this idea in especially white religious circles that Black folks want their own church, that they want their own, communities. And so that's why. And so when you see a church claiming to be diverse or multiracial, what that usually means is that you have a white pastor, a white senior pastor, and then maybe a Black worship leader or a few Black folks sprinkled in. And so we see people, the white church taught us to see relationships as transactional. In other words, it's what you bring to the table. It's your talents, it's your abilities. And unfortunately, Black folks have been treated like this in our nation since our founding. The whole minstrel show, the whole idea of you have a talent, that we like and you're entertaining to us, or you're really gifted with song or with music, and so we want to showcase you in our white church. And so as long as we continue to see people for what they can bring to the table instead of who they are as a person in all of their multifacetedness. And then also, I think for a lot of white pastors, I was one once. I'm no longer a pastor, but I think white pastors need to be willing to give up their power, to give up their control, and to say, you know what? I'm going to go sit under a black pastor. I'm going to go serve on the staff of a predominantly black congregation. And I'm just going to serve, and I'm going to learn, and I'm going to give back, and I'm going to do that. Instead of forcing black men to come into these church networks or these denominations that have been set up for white folks, for the benefit of white folks, we've got to stop seeing people based upon their gifting alone and see them as an entire person that have anointings and blessings and multifacetedness to their person and to their soul and to their experience and to their mind. And we got to be willing to listen. And what that means practically is that as white people, we've got to be willing to step aside, to be quiet, to listen, to learn, and to move forward together and to elevate voices that are not our own.
And that's a really nice way to end this conversation. We could go on, and at least I could go on and on forever.
Yes, sir.
We've got a limit here, and Scott, I appreciate you being here and sharing the memories of your eternal friendship with Roy. I'm sure Roy would be proud that he is remembered so fondly by someone who was close to him.
Mel, thank you so much. It's been an honor. I'd love to come back and continue the conversation anytime.
Absolutely. Anytime you want to come. So
Appreciate
if today's conversation resonated with you, I encourage you to learn more about Scot Loyd and his work, including the God I Was Given, which is the book that he referenced. I also recommend reading his essay, A Letter to Roy, He's the Black Kid in My Pictures, as a companion to this discussion. That's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Until next time, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.